The Battle of Cartagena de Indias was an amphibious military engagement between the forces of Britain under Vice-Admiral Edward Vernon and those of Spain under Admiral Blas de Lezo.It took place at the city of Cartagena de Indias in March 1741, in present-day Colombia. The battle was a significant episode of the War of Jenkins' era and a large-scale naval campaign. The war later was subsumed into the greater conflict of the War of the Austrian Succession. The battle resulted in a major defeat for the British Navy and Army. The defeat caused heavy losses for the British, mostly due to disease that also took its toll among the Spanish forces, especially yellow fever. Background: the War of Jenkins' era was a conflict between Great Britain and Spain that lasted from 1739 to 1748. Under the 1729 Treaty of Seville, the British had agreed not to trade with the Spanish colonies except under limited conditions. Under the Asiento de Negro slave trade and the annual ship under the Navío de Permisa, the Asiento allowed Britain a monopoly to supply 5,000 slaves a year to the Spanish colonies. The Navío de Permisa permitted a single yearly trading ship, the annual ship, which could carry 1,000 tons of imports to the yearly trade fair in Portobello. Upon receiving these concessions from Spain, the British government granted a monopoly for both to the South Sea Company. The merchants and bankers in Britain, who were the driving force behind Britain's international commerce and trading, demanded more access to the lucrative Spanish markets of the Caribbean basin. In turn, the Spanish colonists desired British-made goods, so a burgeoning black market of smuggled goods developed. By the terms of the treaty, the Spanish were permitted to board British vessels in Spanish waters. After one such boarding in 1731, Robert Jenkins, captain of the ship Rebecca, claimed that a Spanish Coast Guard officer had severed his ear. The legend that Jenkins exhibited his pickled ear to the House of Commons appears to have no basis in fact. This served to heighten the war fever developing against Spain, which was also driven by the British desire for commercial and military domination of the Atlantic basin. To much cheering, the British Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, reluctantly declared war on October 23, 1739, reportedly saying, "They may ring their bells now, they will be wringing their hands before long." Spanish Caribbean. The Spanish Caribbean trade had a network of 4 main ports: Vera Cruz, Mexico; Cartagena, Colombia; Portobello, Panama; and the main port through which all the trade of those 3 ports came, Havana, Cuba. On November 22, 1739, the British captured Portobello in the Viceroyalty of New Granada. The British attack was part of an attempt to damage Spain's finances. The poorly defended port was attacked by 6 ships of the line under Vice-Admiral Edward Vernon. The relative ease of this capture, although it was quickly recaptured by the Spanish after Vernon's fleet departed, caused jubilation in Britain. Vernon was given command of the very large naval force, which was 1/4 of the British Royal Navy, of a major land and sea amphibious expedition under the overall command of Lord Cathcart. The first goal of the expedition was to capture Havana, the most important of the Spanish ports because it had facilities where ships could be refitted, and by 1740, it had become Spain's largest and most active shipyard. Lord Cathcart died en route and it remained unclear who was in command overall. Cathcart's untimely demise resulted in dissension in the British command, preventing the coordination needed for this complex operation. The dispatch of the large fleet and troop contingent had been demanded by the public, led by the merchant class lobbies, especially, and the South Sea Company, in particular, which refused to accept the compromise agreements made by the governments of Spain and Britain. The Duke of Newcastle advocated the public's demands before Parliament. Vice-Admiral Vernon was an active and ardent supporter of war against Spain and advocated offensive action both in Parliament and before the Admiralty. The decision to mount a large West Indies expedition was reached in December 1739. Walpole, who opposed the war categorically, and Vernon, who favored small squadron actions, were dissatisfied with the situation. Vernon, despite his earlier failed small squadron raid on Cartagena, was not convinced that a large-scale attack on a heavily fortified city would prove to be as successful as his smaller Portobello assault had been. He feared, particularly, that a prolonged siege would lead to heavy attrition from disease. A typical situation given the limited medical knowledge of the time. Objectives: Britain's objective was to capture and permanently retain Spain's 4 ports of the Caribbean basin. By taking control of these ports, the British would effectively control the entry and exit routes to South America. The British would have bases from which to launch attacks into the interior, and Spain would have limited access to deep-water ports on the eastern coast of their American colonies and therefore be unable to resupply their inland forces. Control of these ports would provide the British with a key control of the area and allow them, in time, to acquire the whole of Spain's American empire. However, Britain had no place to build and refit ships in the Caribbean, as Spain did with the dockyards at Havana, and without a dockyard, no fleet could remain in the area for any length of time without breaking down. Quick capture of Havana and its dry dock was imperative, and it was the favoured objective of Newcastle and Sir Charles Wager, First Lord of the Admiralty. But Britain's divided ministry left the course of the campaign up to Vernon and others at a council of war held in Jamaica. They followed Vernon, who preferred Cartagena as their initial objective as it was a good port and to windward of Britain's existing Caribbean bases, and Vernon thought Havana too well defended to be the initial target. The city of Cartagena de Indias, Cartagena of Indies, in the 18th century, was a large and rich city of over 10,000 people. It was the capital of the province of Cartagena, and the main town had significant fortifications that had been recently repaired, increased and improved with outlying forts, batteries and works. Its harbour was considered one of the finest in the world, and it served the galleons of the commercial fleet, Galeones at Tierra Firma y Peru, that annually conveyed through Havana to Spain the immense revenues of gold and silver from New Granada and Peru. Founded by Pedro Heredia in 1533, it had been the target of conquest in the past and was captured by the English, under Francis Drake, in 1585, and by the French, under Baron de Pointus in 1697. The city faces the Caribbean to the west. To the south its bay has 2 entrances, Boca Chica and Boca Grande. Boca Chica was the only deep-water entrance and was so narrow it allowed the passage of only 1 ship at a time. This entrance was defended on one side by the Fort San Luis with a couple of small outworks on the peninsula of Terabomba, and on the other side by the fastened battery Baradera. Beyond Boca Chica was the great lagoon of the outer harbour, with an entry channel into the inner harbour between 2 peninsulas, each defended by a fort. The walls of the city itself mounted some 160 cannon, and the suburbs 140 guns. The city was surrounded by a water-filled ditch and its gates supported by recently built bastions. The suburbs were also surrounded by a wall and ditch. About a quarter-mile south from the city on a hill was Fort San Lazaro, a square 50 feet on a side with 3 demi-bastions. The position of Fort San Lazaro commanded the city itself and the plain around the hill. There was also a small hill nearby that commanded Fort Lazaro, but there was no fresh water source available outside Cartagena and the fort. The road from the best landing point, the beach at Texar de Gracias, to Fort Lazaro was 3 miles long.